Welcome to the Christian Atheist, episode 34, Hegel versus Kant, Concluding Remarks, Part 1. This episode, along with the next, form a single episode, but needed to be cut in two because it was too long, so they're best watched in conjunction with one another. We ended our last episode with the assertion that there's nothing new in postmodern thought. In fact, I would argue that it represents an archetypal response to human existence, that of Cain. It is an attitude characterized by resentment, that is, a sullen rejection of the world as it is constituted, a sense of victimhood and self-righteous indignation, a refusal to modify one's own actions, thoughts, and conceptions in response to objective feedback. It is an attitude of wounded anger and pride, setting itself as both creator and judge of reality. It is self-righteous in the most egregious meaning of that term, demanding that the world conform to its own expectations, refusing the correction of transcendence by wallowing in immanence, certain of its own righteousness. It is an arrogant demand for recognition in the face of reality's constraints. Like the critical and postmodern theorists, it is a rejection rather than an acceptance of reality. It is a recognition of self as other than ideal, and it hates the ideal because an ideal is always a judge. It is an attitude of what Jean-Paul Sartre called bad faith. That is, its resentment is a consciousness of its own responsibility as a refusal to be conscious of it. It is the project to deny personal responsibility. Left unchecked, this attitude becomes murderous. As I have said elsewhere in The Christian Atheist, it is a response that is open to any individual or ideology. Excuse me. Right or left, theist or atheist. Cain murders the ideal, that which highlights his own inadequacy, his failure, and sets up a counter-ideal, an immanent rather than a transcendent one, his own reality in place of God's. See Isaiah 5:20. It follows also that nothing in Hegel was new. So why my fuss over the ongoing battle between Kant and Hegel if it is just the same as the forces that have been battling in humanity since we became rational beings? Am I not arbitrarily blaming Hegel for the ills of mankind? I trace the problems of prescriptive Hegelianism over the past 10 episodes of The Christian Atheist. I have learned a great deal by doing these commentaries, as they have forced me anew into the material and allowed me to interact with critical assessment of my ideas and formulation. I am more convinced than ever that it is the battle between Kant and Hegel that structures our social unrest and the horrific ideological devastations of the 20th century on both the right and the left. In this episode, I would like to detail the specific issues that have taken us here, and what I suggest our response might be. First, Hegel's logic, the dialectic or narrative logic he develops, is a logic of change, not stasis. A very strong case can be made that Hegel did not discover this logic, that its existence can be traced all the way back to the Greeks. Aristotle himself talked extensively about development and change, but he did not formulate this into an alternative logical system. In his Poetics, for instance, he discusses the development of narrative in ways that definitely anticipate Hegel's dialectic. For Aristotle, logic is an absolute systematic complex based on the axioms of non-contradiction and excluded middle, both of which Hegelian logic denies. The laws of logic are transcendent in that we do not create them, but simply discover them. acknowledge them, conform to them as limits to our rational processes. Aristotle would not allow that Hegelian dialectic, or a logic of change, is really an exception to the laws of logic, but insist that it must be accounted for as a special case within traditional logic, a logic of immanence rather than transcendence. What allowed Hegel's dialectic to become an alternative logical system, what many have called a paralogical system, was his abandonment of transcendence, of the primacy of being over becoming, of the distinction between reason and reality. For Aristotle, there was always something to which logic, rationality, must apply. Thus, the logic of being, of stasis, founded in non-contradiction and excluded middle, is the norm. Change, becoming, must be conceived as nested within traditional logic, as dependent upon it, as limited by it. If, however, we abandon the notion of transcendence and embrace immanence and flux as the ultimate reality, suddenly the logic of change takes on a central and not an auxiliary role. This is what happened with Hegel, though to be fair, the idea originated in Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy. Kant, however, maintained a commitment to, a faith in, transcendence that Hegel abandoned. And this abandonment had very specific practical and theoretical results. Like the Enlightenment thinkers, Hegel desired complete clarity of rational understanding, unlimited knowledge, and to achieve it, he collapsed the distinction between knowledge and being, between epistemology and metaphysics. This came at great cost. Nor was Hegel an innovator in metaphysics, as the idea that change is the basis for all that is was put forth by the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus. It is an idea that has great merit. Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, tells us of the interchangeability of matter and energy. That matter is energy. Einsteinian relativity, quite simply, is Heraclitus' metaphysics translated into a rigorous scientific statement. Combining Hegel's logic and metaphysics, we get the primacy of process, of development, of change. And thus, any sense of stasis, of being as stable, as limit, is lost. This new dynamic perspective, I would argue, created conceptual space for the derivation and acceptance of Darwinian evolution, which itself was also clearly articulated by the pre-Socratic Greeks, for Einstein's relativity, for chaos science, quantum physics, and even depth psychology, all of which play on this notion of dynamism. I have argued that Hegel is the villain in this battle of the titans, and I maintain that assessment. But this genie cannot be put back in the bottle. I'm uncertain if I would, even if I could. Hegel's innovation was not invention, not even a new way of thinking, but rather a systematic combination of existing elements that transformed the underlying assumptions about our world wholesale. Remove transcendence, and we no longer live in the same world as our predecessors. Some post-Hegelian philosophers understood the radical nature of this change, and many who sensed its danger sought to oppose it, like Kierkegaard, or to highlight its implications, as in Nietzsche's Death of God. Hegel's system, however, is in a very real sense unavoidable, as the logic of change is also the daily logic of human existence, the stories that we tell, the stories that we live. which I hope goes a long way towards an explanation of why I assert that we are all unconscious Hegelians today. We are limited creatures, bound to a temporal immanence in which life unfolds, story-like, with all its contradictions and uncertainties, often unresolved. Truth, with a capital T, transcendence, is always outside our grasp. Indeed, this is what constitutes the transcendent. We can believe in it. We can seek to approximate it. We can asymptotically approach its understanding, but it remains an ideal we pursue, never an achieved totality we apprehend. It stands as an unachievable limit to our immanence. Discard transcendence and the center, to put it in Derridian language, no longer holds. The West's hard-won universalism degenerates again into the warring of the tribes. If there is no truth upon which we can agree, we are thrown back into Hobbes's bellum omnium contra omnes, war of all against all. And the postmoderns are correct. Power, and only power, rules. This was the same position as that maintained by the sophists in the days of Plato and Aristotle, against which they fought tooth and nail. Hegel's turn to immanence, however, goes wrong in that it ignores the reality of the transcendent in our experience, in what Sartre terms our ontology. We experience the transcendent everywhere in our daily lives as limitation, as the real barriers against which we bump, the structure within which we live, move, and have our being. Acts 17:28. The more fully we embrace the paralogic of immanence, the less account we take of these limitations, the more arbitrary they seem, the greater our indignation at being limited, judged. Hence, resentment. Plato documented the decline of the society in which freedom becomes ever more resistant to limitation in the Republic, Book 8. The inevitable decline ends, he says, in tyranny. In short, Hegel's immanence and paralogic are uniquely structured to encourage the pathology of Cain, the resentment against being, the real and ideal limit itself. As mentioned above, resentment against being leads to the critical assessment of the existing world order as failed, as evil, and the notional creation of a new world order, a utopia of immanence toward which the intellect that constructs it, envisions it, imagines it, becomes irresistibly drawn. A new supreme value replaces the transcendent and the power of its ideal. This is the pride of life. The fact of a valued world, itself transcendent, is not so easily dispensed with, however. We human beings find ourselves in a world of values. We do not construct them. This is a fundamental truth of Sartrean ontology, of human psychology. We can live in no other world, whatever metaphysical explanation we might offer. It is thus that we come to understand the dominance in our world of consequentialist ethical systems, of ends justifying the means ethical thinking, another legacy of the prescriptive Hegelians. Having replaced transcendence with immanence, we no longer conceive of ethics in terms of right and wrong having been relativized, but only in terms of effectiveness in achieving a result. Right and wrong are rewritten as efficiency in light of a chosen value. For a Kantian, this is not another ethical system, but the very destruction of ethics itself. If value is chosen, value itself becomes arbitrary, tribal. Absent a transcendent limit on value hierarchies, there cannot even be universal moral prescriptions against murder, slavery, rape. But lived human existence requires a value hierarchy, and thus a highest value. For a highest value, all else must be sacrificed, and as there is no right or wrong outside of effectively achieving the goal, all means to that end are justified. Truth, itself relativized, socially constructed, has value only insofar as it is useful. This is the common, explicit position of the prescriptive Hegelian tradition. For consequentialism, all actions can be justified. In this way, cheating, lying, plagiarism, grade inflation, lack of rigid requirements for academic success, participation trophies, rewarding of mediocrity, etc., are all justified, practiced, even celebrated as the highest of virtue, often justified in the name of social justice, self-esteem, and kindness, conceived as ultimate values. Check out our podcasts, The Christian Atheist, where faith and reason fuse in the incarnation, and Simple Gifts, the written word spoken for you, available on all your favorite podcasting apps. You can find more great content on our YouTube channel at John and Jenny Wise, where you can join the discussion, comment, like, and most of all, subscribe. Or stay up to date on Facebook at J&J Wisewords. Finally, to book an occasion, go to wisewordsforyouroccasion.wordpress.com. All these links can also be found in the description below this video.